if you had to do a mainstream American comedy starring Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, what era would you set it in, and how what
Uh,
would your approach be?
I would set it during the Harlem Renaissance. And what would my approach be? Let me see. It would be Tiffany Haddish trying to set Kevin Hart up, find him a wife, except in the process, she finds herself a partner. She's the one who falls in love instead of him. That's what I would do.
It wasn't that I had not known I was different.
I have papers for you. Wherever you go, they will protect you.
As I reached 16, I realized Hitler had a plan for us.
We have a new girl joining us today. Her name is Lena Schlegel. It's a good German name, but your face is so un-German.
Schlegel is my mother's name.
Shouldn't you be going with them?
Are you spying on me?
I wanted to know if you were all right.
If his father catches you with his boy, he'll kill him before he comes and kills us.
Hey everybody, this is Mike, and you're listening to the Reelblack podcast, and this is a very special conversation we have in store with you. It's been 4 years since the movie Belle came to the United States, and we had a chance to chat with our guest Amma Asante, and she's with us now on the line, joining us from London, or England.
You said my name
England.
perfectly. You actually said my name so perfectly.
I've been practicing. That's a big question because it reads differently. That's my number one question. Can you please tell people how you say your name?
Yeah, I say my name Amma Asante, but I'm used to Americans saying my name Amma Asante, so I respond to either.
Okay, and that's a Ghanaian name.
It is, yeah. It means a girl born on a Saturday, of which I am one.
We have an opportunity to speak because
Hmm.
you have your latest film in theaters now,
I do, yes,
Where Hands
yes.
Touch.
Yeah. So Where Hands Touch is the story of a 16-year-old young woman, Afro-German woman, Lena Schlegel, and it tells the story of her coming of age year, I would say. It's set in 1944 Berlin. It's at the time when Hitler is absolutely doing his worst across Germany and the rest of Europe, specifically to the Jews. But it tells the story of how she comes of age in that context and her struggle for identity and survival all at the same time.
I love all of your work, and this is
Thank you.
no different for me because I not only, I mean, does this film catch you at the top of your game, but every time I see an Amma Asante film, I'm forced to reevaluate my perspective
Mm,
in a way, from
mm.
because as an American, we look at race, I think, a little differently than European.
Possibly. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the Afro-European relationship with the African-American relationship is that we have big fat overlaps, right? We have huge overlaps, but we do also have some differences. And I think that that's possibly, what my stories bring to the table.
So you have Amanda Sternberg as your lead, who's American.
Yeah, Amandla is absolutely American. I think she was about 6 years old when I first started researching it and writing this movie. So I like to think that it took this long to get it financed and made because we were waiting for her.
Well, she no doubt gives an incredible performance, and she's having a great year also as we speak. She's going to have two movies in theaters, your
Mm-hmm.
film as well as
Mm-hmm.
The Hate You Give, which is coming.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so I mean, in terms of so let's go down the line. Unfortunately, I've not seen your very first film, and
No,
we'll talk about.
no.
I met you
Mm-hmm.
at Bell, and I've seen everything since, and every film challenges me because as much as I want to say I'm a proud black man, I know I'm conscious and I know everything. You're always unveiling stories that have never even entered my realm of conception.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing when you're born outside of America as a person of color, so you're born outside of Africa, you're born outside of America, as I am, is you realize that the dominant diaspora story is the African American one. And that's why so many people of color outside of America relate to being black through America. That's partly how we do it. But our stories are a little bit different. They're definitely siblings, but they're not identical twins. And so that's what's interesting to me. And so I bring you the stories that maybe help me to understand a little bit more about myself, a little bit more about the various set of communities that I come from, but also stories that I had not heard of until the moment I discovered them, you know?
Yeah. Now you said where hands touch is something you've been working on for like the last 12 years. But how did you discover the idea? I mean, I know that there were Afro-German kids born after the war, but I never
Right.
knew that there were Afro-German kids that were that. I mean, I knew and also knew that there were black people oppressed in Nazi Germany. They were sent to the ovens just as much as
Yes.
Jews. But this story is so unique. How did
Yeah.
you come to
Yeah.
zero in on that one?
And I think it's really special what you pinpoint there, because there were different kinds of Afro-Germans in a way in Germany at the time, you know, during Hitler's reign. I came across the generation of children who were biracial, who were Afro-Germans, who were born between the wars, between the First World War and the Second World War. After my first film, I shot my first film in a place in the UK, South Wales, which had some of the oldest black communities in Europe. And it dawned on me that I really didn't know anything about them. And I thought, you know, how can I be born and raised in this place? And I actually know so little about the history of other people like me. So of the diaspora, born of, you know, African heritage, but born and raised in Europe. Why do I know so little? And it also dawned on me that the Black history that I knew most about was African American history. But even in that, I only really knew one part of it, you know? There's so much more scope to African American history than we get taught or we get access to. And there's virtually nothing outside of that for the diaspora. So I started to Google and explore immediately after I finished making my first film. I was still doing the festival tours. And I just initially, early research was just getting online and just, you know, Googling the terms, you know, history, you know, Afro-Europeans, Black people in Europe, you know, just doing that general search. I kept coming up with this term, the Rhineland bastards. It just kept coming up over and over. You know, at first I wasn't drawn to it because I didn't like the term. And I didn't even really know what it was referring to. But after it came up so many times, I had to dig into it. And alongside this term was a photograph of an Afro-German girl. She's standing in a school uniform with her little afro. And she's surrounded by what Hitler would have called Aryan white girls, children, also in school uniforms. Her face is totally unreadable. And I'm much like the image of Belle. I'm looking at her and I'm wondering who she is, where she's come from, how did she get there, and what has happened to her? What did happen to her? And I'm, you know, I look at these stories of women of color and I'm immediately connected to them, and I want to know, and I want to be able to amplify their voices. And so I start trying to research her. I can't get any information other than her image was used as an example of what non-Aryan features look like by the Nazis. That's the information I can get of this little girl.
Right.
Um,
And you use that sort of in that classroom scene that they use. She's
right,
the characters uses.
exactly. Exactly, exactly. This was the experience of these children. What I discover though, because I'm there sitting there thinking, oh my God, if there were black children and Afro-German children in Nazi Germany, well, we know what they did to the Jews. So, oh my goodness, what must they have done to black people and these children in particular? And as I start to explore this story, I realized, yes, they were persecuted. Yes, some of them ended up in camps. Yes, of course, some of them ended up murdered. But every assumption I had was somehow confounded by the fact that whatever was happening to these, I can't really call them communities, because black children or black people didn't live as communities by the time that Hitler was at his worst. Those communities had been broken down and broken up, and these children grew up essentially not really knowing each other. They were isolated. But, what must have happened to these children? And I learned that while they were persecuted, they were not exposed to the mass murder machine that the Jews were, that their persecution was on a one-to-one basis, an individual basis. And there was a really clear reason for that, which is that when you look at when their fathers came to Germany as part of the occupation, the French occupation after World War One, there was a certain amount of time that was left for these children to be conceived and then born by the time you get to World War Two. So they're relatively young. They are not seen by Hitler to have any kind of real influence on Germany. And I'm specifically speaking about the Rhineland children, the children that were born of these French African soldiers. So they're not teachers. They're not doctors. They don't really have any money in the economy. They have no influence that Hitler could see as a threat in the way that he could, dump on Jewish people who had been integrated over many generations. But the one power they had was that they could procreate. They could taint his dream of a pure, and I'm doing the inverted commas there, a pure Aryan Germany. And he realizes, I got to be careful, because I can't just go and whip these children away from their so-called Aryan mothers, because I don't really know who their mothers' fathers are, or their brothers are, or their uncles are. Are the SS? Are they in the Gestapo? Who are, and if I start to pick on these women, what might the pushback be from other so-called Aryan Germans? So he decides he's going to do it very quietly. He's going to take them from school, and he'll take them from the street, and he'll have them sterilized without any anesthetic, and then he'll quietly put them back in their homes, and they'll die out within one generation. He doesn't need to do any more.
Wow.
So if you meet the wrong SS officer on the wrong day, however, as an Afro-German, you meet that wrong SS officer on the wrong day, you will be whipped to a camp. But if you kept your head down and your mother could protect you enough, you didn't meet that wrong SS officer on the wrong day, you could survive as an Afro-German in a way that you absolutely could not if you were known to be Jewish. And that was therein laid the whole unexpected nature of this experience, which still, however, was not a good experience, because what it meant, Mike, was that you as a black person, as a black child, were persecuted without a community. Right? You were left alone. There were no Jewish people who could identify with you in terms of persecution, because they were all dead or gone and being worked to death. There were no people of color, because they were so few and far between. You couldn't reach out to one. You are literally isolated and submerged within white supremacy. And your only way to survive is so-called assimilation, which by its very nature is violent, because you don't have any choice in this. It's not like, I don't know, you travel to Paris because you like French culture and you think, I love French culture, I'm going to assimilate with this culture. No, this is forced, because it's about survival and nothing else.
Well, let's put a pin there and then broaden it out to your entire body of work. Because what's great, I mean, having the distance of of three films to talk about. I'm
Uh-huh.
seeing, when we first met, it's just sort of like representation. This is the movie. I love this genre of film, Belle, Victorian era thing, and I could never imagine myself being in that world. And then you found a story where you could place us there, and then
Yeah.
United Kingdom. Um, we're seeing a whole nother level of empower. You and David Oyelowo. See how well I'm with the names, the pronunciations.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Um,
yellow.
yes, sharing a story with us about something's lost to American history.
Mm.
The king, marrying a
Mm.
commoner in England and bringing her back
Mm-hmm.
to be his queen in Africa, Botswana, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
now,
correct,
and
correct.
now, where hands touch. So as I was watching Where Hands Touch, I said, this film is so much of now, but it's also so much more for the future, because as the world gets browner and browner, there are going to be more biracial girls, biracial boys that they're going to look to your body of work and say, "Wow, I see myself here. I can identify, and I do have a place in this world." Where so much, like you said, you're isolated, you're erased, not only erased from history books, but literally erased. I mean, your character in Where Hands Touch is literally fighting every moment for her right to exist, not only as a German, but just as a human being. And I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think you're right, and it's important. My niece is biracial, and as she was being conceived, that was when or as she was about to be born, I should say, that was when I decided I wanted to tell this story that was supposed to be my second movie, that's taken 12 years to bring to fruition. And that they told me was too big for me. It was too big for me, and I should go away and find something else to do. And then I embarked on, a plan to prove to the powers that be that why this film wasn't too big for me. And, Belle became a part of that, and so too did it, a United Kingdom eventually. But had I made this film, Where Hands Touch, as my second film, there would have been no Belle, certainly not the Belle you saw on screen. And there certainly wouldn't have been a United Kingdom in the way that you saw it on screen either. But my way into these stories, strangely enough, is through the Black parent. For me, what's really important, and I've not told this in any interview, so this will be the first time that I speak about this in an interview.
I get the air horn. It's a Reelblack exclusive, exclusive, exclusive.
Oh, now it's going to just be a letdown. Don't do that.
I appreciate you. Stop.
So, my mother, when she came to the UK, she came pregnant with my sister, and my brother was 2 years old. He was born in Ghana. I wasn't born yet. I wasn't to be born for another decade. And my father had come 6 months before her, as is kind of quite traditional in these migration stories. And he had come to, lay the ground, the landscape for his wife to arrive in a more safe environment. And when my mother came, she came with a year's worth of money for her and my father to be able to get themselves on their feet in this new country that had invited them but did not want them. And where she got that money from was my great uncle, her uncle. And the reason why he had that money to give her, he was a village man. He didn't reside in the capital of Ghana. He resided in the village. He got that money because he received a British pension all of his life. And the reason why he received a British pension was because he fought in the Second World War for Britain. And those stories, they just don't get told. So when I started my research for Where Hands Touch, I discovered not just the story of these soldiers from the French colonies who were brought to Europe to fight for, France and other countries that had colonized Africa in the First World War. But I also clearly discovered the story of the African American soldiers that also came and were part of liberating the camps. Those soldiers who were told, no, you didn't. You were not there. And they said, well, yes, we were. And they said, no, you weren't. They were told that their stories were not true, essentially being told that they were liars. And it wasn't until images were discovered many decades later that showed these African American soldiers in front of a camp and standing in front of dead bodies, that they were actually vindicated and told, oh, yes, here you were. If those images had never been found, those soldiers would have never have been acknowledged. And so for me, I feel that we have been there at key times in history. We have been there, we have existed, both in extraordinary times like the Holocaust and in ordinary times. But we've been erased. And because of that, you have situations where people can walk through the streets today and be pumping their fists and talking about who will and will not replace them, because somehow the history has been so skewed towards them that it's acceptable for them to believe that they have a greater stake in a society, in a country, in a community than anybody else. If you falsify somebody's history, you falsify their future. And for me, that's the key. So yes, it's very important. I tell stories of isolated Europeans. And that sometimes means that they are biracial. Sometimes it means that they're black, like David Oyelowo's character, completely African, like his character was in A United Kingdom. And he, chose to marry a commoner. And I'm so glad that you spelled that out. As you talked about the piece, she was a commoner. But it always means, usually in my stories, that somehow they're isolated and they have to find a way to their identity. They have to find a way to defining themselves, because as someone who was raised in Europe, I am completely obsessed with how you do that, how you navigate your way to a sense of identity, how you define yourself, oftentimes in an existence that doesn't want to see you reflected.
With our channel on Reelblack, we have the privilege of being able to dig out things from the past. Actually, there's a film, I don't know if you're aware of, Men of Bronze from 1977.
No, I'm not.
Yeah,
Wow.
he's a black documentarian. He passed away in 2013, but he had a second film, which has basically been banned because of what you just said, called Liberators. From 1992, where it won all kinds of awards, and then they basically were forced to, rescind everything because they had the same claim that you were saying, that they made up certain things about the blacks that liberated the camps and things like that. So yeah, it's in a way it was nominated for an Oscar, and it was actually discredited completely. It's a very, very difficult film to find.
Wow.
Like 2018, it feels like this is a tipping point in so many ways, because Hollywood has embraced Wakanda, but only 0.4% of the films in Hollywood are being directed by women.
By black women. I mean, first, I just want to go back on something that you've said there. That's really important, that what you say about this film being discredited, because there have been some reviews of this film on key platforms, key platforms that amplify the voices of journalists. And when I think of a journalist, I think of research. I think of researchers. That's how I think of journalists. But on key platforms who have in their own way discredited the history that is found so easily with a cursory search on Google, or you don't even have to go to a library to find this research. But it is, words like, or phrases like Lena is supposedly the child of a French African soldier. The implication, and let's not pretend, we know what these implications are. We've had to be reading between the lines with microaggressive racisms since we were in the womb. So we know when somebody says, allegedly or supposedly, what you're really saying is, oh, I don't believe this history exists. And what you're doing today is you are denying the history, which does go way back you know, before Afro-Germans, but you are denying a history of the diaspora. You are denying a history of Afro-Germans who still today struggle with being identified as Afro-Germans. The idea that they exist is still, you know, it's still challenged often for them. I just got off the phone to an actress who is Afro-German, who was speaking to me about this, who wants to do a pre-screening of the film in Germany. So one way in which the history is silenced is by not even questioning it, but poo-pooing it and completely denying it. Now, this is something that happens to Black communities over and over again. And what that means is that even when we are presented with our own history, we too question it. We too challenge it. Of course, there are people who are Black who have questioned whether this history of Afro-Germans can even be real, because it has been suppressed from them for so long that it becomes unbelievable to them. And what happens is we end up in a space where we don't have the privilege of being able to understand that people who look like us, but are raised during other times, they are products of other times and other places, can respond differently to us because we are of another time and another place, because we have not been allowed to study that history or know that history that would give us a greater understanding. So when I talk about, you know, somebody having to assimilate, being forced to assimilate as a means of survival, when I talk about that as a violent act, and understanding that I wouldn't respond the way that Lena has done as a woman of today, as a woman of 2018, you know, born and raised in Europe, but I would if I were Lena and I were born when she was born and I was a product of that same time and that same extraordinary experience that she's a product of. But without us learning of each other's experiences, of these diaspora experiences, we can't have compassion for them. We just get angry with them because we think, well, why would she do that? Why would she have conversations with a boy who's in the Hitler Youth? A, because we don't know that the Hitler Youth was mandatory, but B, because we don't understand or accept that when our persecution has existed within a community and her persecution is existing without a community, and therefore it's upon us to have compassion. And then when we deny our history as a diaspora, that allows for those who have a greater platform to be able to say, oh, there's a little bit of division within that group of people, so no one will come back at me if I write about this movie, if I write about this story and poo-poo the history, because they're already so angry with this history, they won't even question me acting like it didn't exist, because they're all so busy infighting with each other that I can say what I like about this history and it will just go over everybody's heads or land in their brains in the way that I've presented it, which is to say it never really happened and it wasn't really true. And that has happened to us since time began. It's called divide and rule.
We have Charles Woods, I wanted him to join us. He hasn't seen the film yet, though, but he breaks down in Hollywood films. There's what he calls a 3D effect, rules. When you depict an interracial relationship, there are certain tropes and rules that continue to exist, basically to reinforce the status quo at the end. And what I like about your film is that you break free of the majority of those tropes. I mean, one of them is just the dramatic ending. I'm not going to give that away. But you know, agency is also a big thing in terms of empowering characters and allowing folks to see us beyond the right to exist, and beyond our humanity. But as we've always been here, and these things have always been true.
We have.
You know, there's always been what you call race mixing, and there's always been illicit affairs and teenage pregnancy and all this stuff. But for whatever reason, the paintbrushes that were used in the past didn't necessarily choose to depict them or create make it as a sin to do so, so.
Right, right. And that agency is really important. And, tropes like the white savior, I get a lot of people saying, I bet this has a white savior in it. You can bet your bottom dollar it doesn't. And what and of course, once again, what they're basing it on are those stories that in the past that maybe have featured us, but haven't necessarily had a Black director or haven't necessarily had a Black female director. So you can't assume what you're going to get, because now this goes back to the question you asked me earlier, that 0.4%. So when we look at women, Black female directors, what often happens is that when research is being done, studies are being done, and they're counting up the figures for us in Hollywood, we often are consumed in the figures for overall for women directors. And what that does is it hides the reality of how low our figures are. Then the other thing that often happens to us is that when they are counting us, we're swallowed up in the figures for Black male directors, because that then becomes about Black people. So we either fall into the category of women or we fall into the category of Black people. And so the figures for Black men consume us. And so it hides the fact of just how low, just how horrible the figures are for women. Well, when you strip all of that back, and I mean for Black women, when you strip all of that back and you say, well, let's take white women out of the equation and let's just take Black men out of the equation for a moment and just let's look at the figures for stories that make it to the big screen that have been directed by women. That's when you get the figure, or at least you did in 2014, of 0.4%. And that means that obviously we don't even make up a percentage point. And so how can you judge the kind of stories that we're going to put out there based on what you've seen before when we're in our infancy? And I don't mean we're in our infancy in terms of how long we've been trying to tell stories, because we have Yuzan Palsy and we have, Black female directors who have been making stories in Africa and outside of Africa for a long, long time. But we're in our infancy in terms of, well, how do we get to the second movie? How do we get to the third movie? How do we get to the fourth movie? How do we get to the fifth movie? Because it's hard enough for a white woman to do that. It's hard enough for a Black man to do that. We're at the intersection of race and gender. And, I often say, well, white men are always telling white women what to do. We know that. But everybody tells Black women what to do. Everybody, women in general, we're often being told to be quiet and stay quiet and, why have you got an opinion and why do you want to tell that story about this particular thing? But for Black women, it's everybody. And so that's the struggle.
So, I mean, obviously there's a system in place, and I don't know, I can't tell from my perspective if it's being dismantled somewhat, or this is just the result of perseverance, or there are just so many platforms that the ratio is the same, but there's just more opportunity for everybody because the gatekeepers or the fact that people can sort of cast their own net into the stream to begin with, and show people what they're worth. I mean, I don't know what it means, but
I think it's all of the above, Mike. I think it's all of the above. I think it's all those things are coming together. And it's a question as to whether all of those things can lead us into a paradigm shift, a genuine paradigm shift, or whether once again it's a trend.
So
And
how
that's the
how
key.
did you? I mean, obviously, if we're talking, your first film was 2004. It's a different world. Like I don't know, I don't begin to give young filmmakers advice on how to break through from my perspective. But specifically, how did you make that shift and go on your path? And what are some of the obstacles that you've had to endure that you would tell people, "Oh, look out for this."
Yeah, I mean, so I think oftentimes we do talk about entry level. How do you get to make your first film? How do you make it? How do you make a short that gets attention, and can become your calling card so that you can make the feature perhaps that you want to make. And I think the key for me is that the last three movies, if you like, so since my first movie, have been a journey towards making Where Hands Touch. As I say, that what would have been my second movie. And I question whether I would have gotten to even 4 movies if I had made that as my second movie. I'm not sure. I was utterly driven. When I was sent the picture postcard for Belle, I looked at that postcard, was completely intrigued, was completely motivated to want to tell a story on the one hand, but on the other hand, I thought they won't let me make the movie I want to make because I want to make a movie where the black girl's the lead. And I don't know if they're ready to tell that 18th century where we push this white girl into the background and we pull this black girl into the forefront. And my producer kept telling me they will just write the film you want to make, and they will allow you to. I promise you now they will. And I thought, okay, I didn't believe him. But I thought, let me do this because if I do, they will allow me, they will see that I can make a lovely, polished, British movie, and they will allow me to make Where Hands Touch. And by the time I finished Belle, I didn't have all the money for Where Hands Touch. And so when David Oyelowo came to me with A United Kingdom and said, Amma, I need you and I need your help on this, for all sorts of reasons, I thought, okay, I can use drones, I can use cranes, I can shoot, the biggest movie that this budget will allow. And then they can no longer ever say again that Where Hands Touch is too big for me. I guess the moral of that story from my point of view and what I would pass on to other filmmakers is there's more than one pathway to arrive at your goal. Now, the good thing is I got there. The difficult thing is that people read the headlines. So what they read is, these stories are all about biracial people, or these stories are all about interracial relationships, as opposed to, no, first of all, I make the movies that to a certain extent I've been allowed to make in order to get to where I want to get to make the movie I want to make. And secondly, there are all sorts of important nuances that tie my movies together, which go beyond the headlines, which I include in my movies in order to show to the powers that be why Where Hands Touch is the kind of movie I should be allowed to make, is the kind of movie that I have the skills to make, is the kind of movie that I should be lending my skills towards. So by that, it's some of the stuff that I've already talked about to you, like what it is to be isolated and raised within a community that doesn't look like you, but somehow you still have to find your way. What it looks like when you're an intersection of class and race and gender. I've told stories about upper class black people, like Dido Bell, an 18th century aristocrat, or David Oyelowo's character, who is a king. I've told stories about working class black people. And in each of those stories, class is important and relevant. I've told stories in which, at least 2 of those stories have featured only the black female or the female of color. Some people don't want to use that term black for biracial. So females of color on the poster. That is a journey. That is to get to a place where you have only the female on the poster, but then only the female of color on the poster is quite some path to walk. So I would say that, but I'm happy that I've gone on that journey, because I think it's made me a better filmmaker. It means that as the stories get bigger and as the stories become even weightier, I'm always going to do my political black backdrops. I'm always going to do my complex, nuanced stories. And that, by the very virtue of what they are, it means that some nuance will go over people's heads and the headlines are going to be easier to read. But that doesn't mean that it's, the headlines are the be all and the end all of the piece. I'm still gonna layer my pieces, and for those who catch the nuance, they catch it, and for those who don't, hopefully they still, enjoy the movie. And I've learned all of that. I've learned all of that through the process. I've learned about how difficult marketing is. I've learned how difficult distribution is. I've learned how it's much harder for, a Black filmmaker to tell their stories than, those who are not Black. I've learned that it's much more difficult when you are female and you add female into that equation. But the reality is tenacity is what will carry you through.
If you had to do a mainstream American comedy starring Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, what era would you set it in, and how what would your approach be?
I would set it during the Harlem Renaissance. And what would my approach be? Let me see. It would be Tiffany Haddish trying to set Kevin Hart up, find him a wife, except in the process, she finds herself a partner. She's the one who falls in love instead of him. That's what I would do.
Ah, okay. All right. So, all right, Kevin, Tiffany, are you listening?
I'm here. I'm available. I can make people laugh. I started in comedy, right? The first scripts I wrote were, I got a 7-script deal with Channel 4 in the UK, and it was for a situation comedy. I can do comedy, Kevin, Tiffany. I'm here.
I love you, Amma. I definitely felt your heart and soul in this film, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All
Thank you. Thank you. Hope to see you sometime.
Yes. All right, be well. Thank you.
You too.
All
You
right,
too.
bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.